Is this on? Okay. All right. Yeah, so thank you for coming and seeing my talk about how to build happy communities. I have renamed it from the talk that I had before that was very dry and not super exciting, so I added an emoji here and an exciting subtitle so that you would know it was going to be exciting. Yeah, so to get started, I'd like to give a little bit of background information about myself and why you should listen to what I'm talking about, I guess. So my name is Kelly Wallick, and I am the founder and the CEO of the Indie MEGABOOTH. I am also the chairman of the IGF and a co-organizer for a conference called BitSummit in Kyoto, Japan. All three of these roles focus on highlighting content of independent game scene with focus on local and global community building. So, how did I get here? Which is a question that I ask myself every day. In my previous life, I was trained as a chemist, and I worked in the field for about 5 years before moving into the games industry. And I was primarily focused on lab management and experimental design, which surprisingly has more overlap in my current role than you might think. For a time, I was managing a lab at MIT that consisted of student courses, graduate research, and professional training courses. The types of people that I worked with there very much remind me of independent developers, which is one of the reasons that I fell in love with working in the industry in this first place, as many of them are technically adept, I guess, and very creative and entrepreneurial, and in some ways very stubborn. They have a very distinct view of the world, and I find that that's very similar to indie developers. So I just have a little bit of a list here of the kinds of communities that I've helped to build and the stuff that I've worked on in the past few years. So as you can see here, I've managed from up to probably 4 or 5 people to up to 600 or 700 developers in our alumni list. So what do I mean when I say about building a community of people that are, I guess, kind of professionals or peers or other entrepreneurs or other indie developers? So I have a couple examples up here, which are things like doing client work or working in intercompany group collaborations. So maybe the research department and marketing department have to work together on something, or maybe you're assigned to work with people in a department that you're not normally familiar with. Probably the thing that I would assume that most people here are interested in is to do professional or community event organization. And so this would be things like local developer meetups, professional societies, email list, private chat groups. I also kind of wanted to throw in here that a lot of these things can be used for doing community organization or activism. So if you're interested in getting people out to, say, to go vote or to do something that you care about within your community, you can also take a lot of these examples and use them for that as well. So say that you've decided that you want to start a community group or that you're going to be joining one. So I think one of the most important things that I want to stress here is that it's really, really important to think about what you're going to do with this community before you start it, instead of just kind of being like, oh, this is going to happen. Taking some time to think about what it is going to look like can be really important. So how do you want your community to be perceived? What is your voice for this? What do you want your image to be? Do you want this to be very buttoned up and very formal? Do you want it to be kind of trendy? Do you want it to be based around an artist or creative communities? And who is this community actually for? So what roles is going to fill? What do you imagine the future of your community is going to look like? If you spend some time, you can imagine what your ideal participant will look like. So what age are they? What are their other interests? What are their interactions like with other members of the community? A lot of times when I talk to people that are starting up their own conferences or their own communities, and I ask them who it's for, basically it's for themselves. So think about someone who is not you that might want to join this community. And I want to stress that it's very important to keep in mind that you want to attract voices that are very diverse and different from yourself within this community as well. Otherwise, you are essentially just building a community of yourself. So what will make these people feel welcome? And on the flip side of that, what will end up making them leave? The basic concept of this is something called personas, which is a client profile. It's a very kind of like markety term for it. There's some very funny stuff if you look up. I think Stephen Colbert did a bit about Qdoba. Has this woman who like works 60 hours a week and exercises all the time and is super trendy and is dating and also eats Qdoba burritos. So you don't have to go that far, but you can kind of imagine who is this person that is going to show up to these meetings and who is going to be part of a community. So although most of this kind of talk is more focused on positive parts of this, I also wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of foundation building and also the leadership roles, and then also what can make people want to leave your community, I guess, in the first place. So like I said, I've broken this down into two different categories here. So the first one is primarily focused on foundation building of the community, which I feel very strongly about is really important. I think what a lot of people do is they start to build up a community, and then once that community is built and it starts having problems, and they start having to slap on codes of conduct later, and they start having to do a lot of conflict management, where really if you had just spent some time thinking ahead and really building up a core foundation, a lot of those problems will kind of self-manage, I guess, in the long term. So early on, it can be really, really tempting to just get as many as people as possible involved in your community. The way that we filter for the megabooth is that we have a really strict curation process. So we spend a lot of time, and a lot of time I mean like 3 months of almost full-time work, going through hundreds of submissions. We research social media and company background information. We learn about the people who are part of it. And we don't only just select on if the games are good or not, we select on whether the company is good or not, and whether we think that they're going to contribute positively to the community, and whether they're doing something that we agree with as well. So on the flip side of that, the game could be really amazing, and if the people behind it are not so amazing, we won't invite them to join the community. So I'm not suggesting that it has to be as strict as that, but it could even be something as simple as a Google form where you have people sign up for it initially. You can have personal referrals, which I think is really important. There's a kind of saying is that if you're going to spend 90% of your time managing 1 or 2 people, it's not going to be very efficient. And like I said, I really feel that, especially early on, it's super important to treat this almost as like a job hire. These are people that you're going to be working with, that are going to be building the foundation of your community, that are going to be representing you when you're not available. And so if you just kind of let anybody in very early on, it could eat up a lot of your time and resources and also turn people off to what you're doing. So if you're not totally willing to gate the community in the way that I'm saying, like you don't want to spend 3 months vetting the people that you're going to be working with, which is fine, you should still spend some time thinking about what kind of culture and environment you want to cultivate, and make it clear the rules and the repercussions for the actions that could negatively impact the rest of your community. Like I mentioned before, having a code of conduct I think is very important. You could find those online. You can put them up somewhere where it's super visible and very easy to find. But like I mentioned before, if you let the kind of foundations of the community rot and they're not very good to begin with, then when you have a problem, you're going to slap a code of conduct on it, and the whole thing is rotted from the inside anyways. And then all you're doing is spending all of your time enforcing a bunch of rules on people who didn't really want to participate in something like that in the first place. That's why I think it's really important to be kind of like picky about who you're going to be working with very early on. And then the other part of it is to lead by example. So if you're not following your own rules, then why would anybody else listen to what you're talking about? So we had to make a lot of decisions in the Mega Booth very early on about what kind of sponsorships we were taking on, what kind of games we were going to be involved with, decisions that we had to make based around some weird stuff that was going on with PAX at the time. And so I think if you stay very consistent to your values, in the short term it can be really difficult, but in the long term it will help to build a better, more sustainable community. So as I mentioned before, so what will make people leave your community? One of the things that people will just kind of get bored and leave eventually is that there's a lack of purpose or a focus. So why would someone spend all of their time participating in something that seems to have no actual purpose? Or if the purpose is too narrow or it's too broad, it will feel really overwhelming. The second one is something that we've had in our own community. I've seen it in other communities. I've dropped out of communities that have this problem, is that you get 1 or 2 people who are super, super vocal, and they end up dominating the mailing list, they end up dominating chat groups, they end up dominating the community overall. And so I think that this leads to a really big fear of speaking up for everybody else. And there's also no motivation for anybody else to participate, because if these 1 or 2 people know every single thing, why would you ever bother to chime in? Because they already have all the answers. So it becomes boring. It also leads to a lot of issues, like the people who are doing the culture and tone policing are essentially dictated by people that you didn't elect to that role. They might not hold the same values as you, and suddenly now your community has been taken over by one or two very loud people. The third point on here is, so if you don't have meaningful work or thoughtful participation, if you're constantly asking for something but you're not be able to provide anything in return, they're going to feel like you're wasting their time. This can also happen when you just have a lot of people who are really involved in it. So if you have like 20 organizers for something that only has a handful of participants, you're just basically have too many cooks in the kitchen. You're not going to be able to define what the goals are, what's expected, what the outcome is. So you can have a lot of confusion and resentment between volunteers and the participants. So while I was thinking about this, I kind of broke it down into two different versions of the types of participants that you can have, and this is more primarily volunteer-based. There's a talk or a panel, I guess it's tomorrow, that's Know Your Worth, where we talk a little bit about how do you get paid for the work that you do versus volunteering. And so this is kind of leaning a little more on the volunteer side, but I would like to say that a lot of this, if you're going to have core people in your team that are going to be doing a lot of work, you're primarily going to have to probably pay them to do the work, because otherwise it becomes too much work. So breaking it down, I have what I'm calling collaborative participation and then actionable participation. So collaborative work would include members of the team or community that are willing to take on a longer-term role or a higher level of responsibility. So these roles should be very concrete, but in the case of where you're not paying them, they should be really non-time consuming. So meaning that the people that are participating in the community and not core members, you need to really discuss with them in advance what their other obligations are, and have some sort of backup plan in case their availability changes. So over time, you don't want to set them up for failure essentially over and over again. So if we're going to use the example of starting up a monthly meetup for developers, you don't want to have someone who has a full-time job and a house and kids and hobbies to be responsible for setting up and getting these things running every single month. So if you sit down with them and you talk to them in advance and you find out what their other commitments are, maybe they can be the person who finds the venue, or maybe they can help to order food, or maybe they can be the person who sends out stuff on the mailing list, but they don't necessarily have to be the person who shows up every single month and sets up all the tables. So on the other hand, the actionable participation are things that you can request from a large group of people that are one-time, low-barrier commitments. So using the previous example of the monthly meetups, if you want to grow attendance, you can send a call to action to the entire current group saying like, hey, retweet this announcement or like this page on Facebook. Basically, you want to make it really simple and you want to make it very easy. So this will prevent burnout and also a lack of participation from an overwhelming amount of options and a seemingly never-ending list of things to pay attention to. For this one especially, you just want to assume that their attention is elsewhere and that they're not paying attention to what you're sending them. And like I had mentioned before, for either of these groups, it's super demoralizing if someone offers their time for participation and then they have no meaningful action they can look back at the end and say, hey, I accomplished this, I contributed in a way that made a difference. If you just request volunteers and then you don't have any plan for them, they'll likely end up feeling that their good intentions were wasted. I did this very early on with the Megabooth a lot when we were primarily volunteer, where I would just send out things like, we need help with the website, or we need t-shirts, or we need this. And these were big, grandiose ideas with no real timelines and no real actionable items behind them, and so people would get really frustrated. So on the other side of this, you want to keep in mind that collaborative participants are not your employees. I had mentioned this a little bit before, but I've seen a lot of communities suffer from like holding on to this expectation that the volunteers and community members can be held responsible for work that is involved in the core foundation of maintaining and growing the entire community. It can be really, really mismatched with the amount of actual work, timelines and goals. Also, especially if it's non-paid work, that's a lot to ask from someone over and over again. So like I mentioned, there's a couple reasons for this. Like if you're not paying them, it's really, really hard to just expect them to be working all the time. You can't assign like high levels of responsibility, and you can't really hold them accountable for when things don't go wrong, or things do go wrong. Also, their motivating factor for participating could be very, very different. It could be sort of self-interest, or if they're working for another company, the motivations of their company are going to overtake the motivations of your community. So you want to think through your expectations and needs, and for a factor and help that is like needed by the participants in your community and business to function, and those primary roles and responsibilities should be handled by a whole separate core team, and primarily, hopefully, someone that you can pay in the future. Really, like, you just don't want to rely on the entire, like, all the members of your community to do all the heavy lifting for you. If you do, it will just end up being passed to multiple volunteers over multiple years. Their other obligations will come before the community. Eventually, will stagnate the growth and make the work feel really pointless in the long run for the volunteers and participants. So a good way to encourage participation and keep your community and partners motivated is to think about it from the other person's perspective, as Janet Jackson did. So aside from your goals with the community and the work, like, what benefit will other people get from it? So what might be exciting for them and easy for you to provide? I had some advice on this, and one of our volunteers had actually confirmed this on Twitter. So one of the things that a friend had told me early on is that if you just give someone $20, they're not going to be very excited about it. But if you give them a free keyboard or a free T-shirt or something along those lines, it's something special. It's something that nobody else will have. It's a tangible item. They get the novelty of receiving something very exciting, which is a lot more interesting than just being handed some cash at the end of it, which might be a very low amount of money in the first place and not buy you very much. So it's something that's memorable that they can look back at and remind them of the good time that they had working with you. So you really want to think about, like, what advantages and things do you have access to that could be interesting for your volunteers or participants that can encourage the participation. And this is super important when you're talking to sponsors, which I've looked over a bunch of people's sponsorship documents over the years, and it's primarily full of all the really cool things you're going to do with all of their money, and not so much of what you're actually going to give them in return. Which is not something that they can kind of sell up to people that are approving the budgets. And a lot of times, the stuff the sponsors want is not something that's actually going to cost you money. Like, they primarily want their logos on things. They want shout-outs and press releases. They want you to just say, hey, thank you for the time and the effort. So if you spend some time having some meetings with the sponsors that you're talking to in advance, like, what are the goals of your department? Who are you looking to reach? Are you looking to reach developers? Are you looking to reach fans? Are you looking to find new content? All of this stuff is very easy for you to be able to give them that is not going to cost you a lot of money. But if you don't think of it in advance, and then you just send them a deck that is like, look at all these cool things we're going to build with the money that you give us, no one's going to want to support that in the long run. So some of the stuff that I'm talking about, most of these communities exist just primarily online, and email list, chat groups, not too frequent in-person meetups, or maybe never. So in the next couple slides, I'm just talking a little bit more about specific tips and methods that you can use to get participation that you need and to communicate effectively with with the people in your community and your partners. So we manage 3 different, primarily like business-to-business mailing lists. So we have event-specific lists, which are very active in the lead-up and during showcases. We have what we call the alumni list, where previous participants can come and communicate on the long term about questions that they might have about their business. And then we also have a public mailing list for developers and press to sign up for to find out about submissions and other major announcements. So the event lists are primarily pretty active. They're straightforward, they're self-motivating, like, teams need this information right away. There's a lot of deadlines coming up, everyone's very excited to come to the show. On the other hand, our alumni list for like 2 or 3 years was kind of this dead zone thing. I didn't really know what to do with it. I just thought it would be a good idea and just threw everyone into it. And then at some point, it just became like a Kickstarter promotional extravaganza. Yeah. It got pretty bad, so everyone was just dumping, like, support my Kickstarter, you know, retweet my thing. So we discussed with a lot of people who had successful mailing lists, and we took a couple of the steps that I have up here, which is that we came up with posting rules. We don't really have too many of them. They're primarily like, be nice to each other, don't spam each other, add a tag before you're talking about your Kickstarter. We also began enforcing the rules consistently, which you kind of have to find someone and assign them to be the bad cop on this, which I'm not very good at, so I just normally have someone else do it. After a while, the rest of the community will become self-policing, and they'll kind of pop in and they'll tell people when they shouldn't be, spamming the list or when they shouldn't be chiming in on things. Like I mentioned, we had added tags for promotional content, so then people could filter stuff that they weren't interested in. A lot of lists, I think, have separate off-topic chat groups. So some will be like, oh, here's our chat mailing list, and here's our actual business mailing list. So after we made all these changes, now we have a pretty active list. We have a variety of posters. We have over 700 companies that are participating in it. We probably have 20 or 30 posts or so a month. Like I mentioned earlier with the kind of job hire concept, a lot of these chat groups can get really dominated by like 1 or 2 people. So, and especially if these posters are combative or defensive, it could eventually kind of kill your list to begin with. And I think kind of sniping this very, very early on and talking to those people on the side and saying like, hey, you need to give opportunities for other people to talk, encouraging people who are a little more shy or a little more quiet that if they posted something, just kind of reaching them off list and saying like, hey, that was really informative, thank you for participating. That can go a really long way. And I think that's probably one of the most important things is to just consistently and very early on stop that kind of stuff from happening. So another part of this is helping to diffuse problems as they occur, which, yeah, a lot of the conversations and a lot of the problems I think that people exhibit when they're on these lists or get upset, like the real solutions are probably out of your control. They're probably really large systematic issues. It doesn't mean that it's not worth spending time understanding this stuff or reaching out to the people. I would really suggest planning action items that your community can take to support them or prevent issues in the future. I know it's kind of difficult, but it's really hard when people of communities that are being oppressed or they're having a lot of issues are normally held responsible for actually solving the problems as well, which adds an extra amount of emotional labor on top of the things that they're already doing. So I think that as a community leader, if you say, hey, this is what our community is going to do to help to make this better for you in the future, that can set a really good tone and a really good example, and it can lead people to participate and help who might not have thought that these things were a problem for them, but realizing that it's part of like an actual community problem. Likely a lot of this stuff happens very, very early on, and this goes back a little bit to the foundation building work that I was talking about, where everybody's kind of testing their boundaries with each other. Everyone's trying to figure out like who's the main poster, like who's the person who has all the answers, who's the thoughtful person, and so a lot of these conflicts will kind of happen in the very early stages of the community building. So as long as you're kind of very vigilant at the beginning part, then the community will start to become self-managing at some point. And other community members will be able to pop in later to say what's acceptable and not acceptable. Personally, I don't enjoy being super front-facing, but you could also issue like large kind of public statements. We did that in the case of PAX when there was a lot of issues surrounding like transgender rights at PAX. We put out a blog post where we talked about it and put up our stance, and then we could reference people to it. And that was something, because it became so large, that it was outside of our immediate community, and the community had gotten large enough that I couldn't personally one-on-one talk to every person about it. So you might want to consider doing something like that if it becomes important enough that you think you need to make a public statement about it. The other thing I'd like to mention is that you don't always have to respond to every single thing that everybody tells you. A lot of times, if it's like antagonistic or non-productive, I would say just don't respond to it. Most times people just really want to be angry and they want to vent, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to respond to it immediately. We do this in the case of when we send out notices that people weren't accepted to the mega booth. We get an influx of emails immediately. I would have people hitting me up on chat and Skype, and primarily just give people time to cool down and really think about it and then have a measured conversation with them. So what we do is like a few weeks later, we'll respond to people and we'll schedule a 30-minute call with them to talk to them about why their submission wasn't accepted. It's not something that we advertise specifically, but it's something that it gives them a chance to vent when they feel angry about it, and then it gives them an opportunity to have the real conversation when they've had some time to think through it. I think Twitter and Facebook and stuff kind of feeds into this idea like you have to instantly be responding to everybody's thoughts and feelings immediately, and I don't always necessarily think that that's very healthy. So this next slide, I think, could kind of be its own talk, but I didn't want to turn it into its own talk. This is kind of highlighting a couple things about remote management. So my early client work was primarily remote focused, so I was lucky enough to have training on this when I very first started. I would also kind of advocate for the fact that if you think that you want to change careers or you want to do something, you should probably get a job in that industry for about a year or two before you move on to starting your own company, just because it gives you the opportunity to get paid to do the work that you want to do and to have somebody else help to train you, and so that you can really understand how these things work instead of just kind of jumping right into it. So some of the stuff here that I have in the common issues column is things like you have varying time zones, differences in communication styles. You don't really have an office culture. You can have people that have issues managing their own time. Interpreting intent is something that I have, depending on how you internalize things. A lot of times when you get emails or people aren't responding, you're kind of putting it on yourself, or, oh, I didn't word that correctly, or, oh, I should have added more explanation points or something. There's problems with clearly describing tasks, lack of boundaries, lack of accountability. So a lot of times, like with tasks and boundaries and accountability, all these things can be very reasonable for you and would make sense, but if you're not actually communicating them clearly to the other person, you aren't seeing them in person, they're not able to read your face, they're not really understanding this stuff. So some of the solutions that I've come up with over the years and things that they're taught to me when I first started working on this is to set up work time expectations and then follow up with increasing levels of communication. So define when they should be available, what hours are they available, what channels are they available on, how do you get in touch with this person if they're not responding on the channels they're supposed to be. Another thing which can be a little hard is I always read the interactions with positive intent. So never ascribe malice when incompetence will do, which is most of the time. You want to clearly communicate your expectations, and this might have to be in the form other than email. I'm a very, very big proponent of phone calls and video calls and Skype chats and all that. I think there's this habit of going back and forth on emails for weeks and weeks and weeks when you could have just picked up the phone and solved the problem in probably 3.5 minutes. A lot of events work is super time sensitive, so I think people who do this kind of work will understand that. But I think it goes a long way, and if you feel like you're just going in circles with someone on email and it's getting really complicated and you're not seeing each other's point of view. There was a guy that we worked with at PAX where I thought he hated us, and he would be really slow to respond on things and be really short and curt. And I'd have phone calls with him, and it seemed better than the emails. And then I met him in person, and he was a 65-year-old man in dad jeans and sneakers, and I realized what he was doing was he was emailing essentially the same way that my mom emails, and he was just really bad at communicating on email, and it had nothing to do with us. It had nothing to do with him as a person. It was just we're on totally different generational planes. Some of the things as well too, like the team building, which I said can be very difficult. What we do for the Mega Booth is we have a Skype holiday party where we all video chat each other. I have everybody order in takeout, and we buy a bottle of wine or champagne, and we all sit and get drunk together on Skype and do a video chat, and that's our holiday party. So you don't really necessarily have to be flying people in from all over the world to have really big, good team building exercises within your own company and community. So some of the points here that I wanted to talk a little bit about, there's on here that define the tools and communication channels. So going back to the kind of two types of collaboration that you can have, so collaborative participation and actionable participation. So collaborative, this is where you want to have really, really high levels of communication. You want to have places that you can keep detailed information on your processes, your resources. You want to have meeting notes, postmortems, all that sort of stuff. So you want to have specialized programs or methods for your team. Verbal discussions, in-person meetings, like I said, can solve a lot of this problem. And so for us, we use Trello to do all of our task tracking, which it's easy, it's free. You just make little cards. It's great to keep track of stuff. We use Skype. Slack has been working really well for the IGF jury stuff. We've moved to using that. For actionable participation, though, you want to limit the communication to only very necessary information. You want to be able to provide multiple ways to find dates and information. You want attached documents to be easy. You want to have language and things that have a low barrier to entry. So you want to make sure you're not using your kind of internal acronyms for things. You want to use stuff like Google Groups or Gmail or Calendar or something that everybody has access to. Even when we request files from people, I don't assume that everybody knows what an FTP is. So we send out like information like, hey, here's how we want you to get us files. Here's some common tools that you can use. Here's some extra information. So since email is still going to be one of the most common forms of interaction, I do a thing, I call it skimmable emails. So I put together these two examples. I'm getting a little short on time because I tend to ramble when I'm talking about this stuff. But so I have two examples of an email here. So this one, and they're both going to have the same goals, but have very different action rates. So in this email, I'm requesting that people RSVP for a networking event that is called the Cool Professionals Group. Very good at naming things. So the reader will need to know the time, the date, and the details of the event, and that I would like them to RSVP. The third item here, which is not actionable, is introducing the person who's organizing the event. So if you look at this email, and you just got this email along 50 other emails that just got sent to you, the first thing you notice is the subject is super vague and very generic. The wording is cramped. It's hard to pull anything meaningful out of this, other than at the end that Kathy is supposedly a really cool person. If you're busy and you open this, you're just going to either ignore it or mark it as on read and forget about it and not pay attention to it. So take a look at the next email here, which kind of have distilled it down a bit, reformatted a lot. So if you take a quick look at this, like you just skim it very quickly. So the first thing that you're going to see is like maybe that you should be RSVPing or that there's a link. Maybe you notice the date and the time. You'll also notice that the subject line has been changed, so we added a tag. So when I say that we add tags to the alumni group, that's what we mean is like put it in boxes up in the top there. So it says that there's action that's going to be taken, there's a date when the response needs to be in. So basically if this person never even opens this email, they've gotten about 75 to 80% of the information that they need just by looking at the subject line. This also makes it easily searchable, and it makes all the information very easy to get to. The time and the date are repeated. The RSVP is clearly the main intent of the email. It also has a Google form link, which a lot of times people will just click it just to see what's in there. If there's only 2 or 3 questions, they'll just answer it right away. So a lot of times I just kind of do that by tricking them that they read the subject line, they click on this link, they answer 2 or 3 questions, and in like 5 minutes they're pretty much done with it. We normally stick to about 1 or 2 action items per an email and maybe 2 or 3 pieces of information. So the lower amount of action items, the more likely you are to get a response. I normally do like a color tagging system as well. So red is urgent and that requires work. Green is for positive benefits or long-term information. And they're bolded and offset. So like I said, you can kind of just skim them and see what's going on. Another thing I'll just kind of run through quickly is that if you look at this, the date that I did this was during GDC, but basically like this is requesting like 3 weeks for somebody or 4 weeks for someone to RSVP and just click on a link. And I'm a really big proponent of the lack of planning on your part is not an emergency on my part. So we schedule in a substantial amount of time for people to respond to things. So saying like to click on this link is going to take 2 weeks. So if someone's coming back from a conference, their inbox is going to be messy. You want to follow up with reminders. A quick rule of thumb for us is that if it takes the other person about 20 minutes to complete the task, then you should schedule about 1 to 1.5 weeks for them to actually get back to you about it. So, and factoring in weekends, like just assuming people aren't working weekends. So you have 2 or 3 days to receive and read the email, 1 or 2 days to act on it, and a buffer of about 2 days for questions or follow-ups. Especially people might have to chase up things internally if they need something. There's nothing more annoying than opening an email and find out that the deadline had already passed 2 days before you even opened the email in the first place. So kind of the very last thing that I wanted to just touch on is that for community leaders and people who are doing community organization, you can spend a lot of time putting other people's needs in front of your own, also kind of being constantly available. You have lots of people vying for your time and your attention. And I think that people that lead towards community leader roles tend to have a really hard time with boundaries. And I think that this can lead to burnout very easily. You can feel pulled in a million different directions. And so you want to keep your community happy, but you don't want to be at the whim of everyone's time. So I'm a really big proponent of turning off your notifications on your phone, not answering emails after a certain time. There's a thing called Boomerang, which has kind of changed the way that I run my emails, essentially. And like you can send emails out at later times, and you can also have them returned to you at later dates. So if you send out an email at 2 in the morning, you can actually have it go out at 7 a.m. so it doesn't look like you were up all night working, because you don't want people to expect you to be working at 2 in the morning. I think this is really, really hard in tech and games industry stuff as well, because people work odd hours and they're always kind of busy and always expecting you to be available. So I think it's really important to care about yourself and do self-care and put boundaries on your time. It will make everything easier for everybody in the long run. I'm going to do the kind of like, not to say yes in smart ways, but to learn to say no to things. Is that, like the quote here, is that saying no to things in a very smart way and saying yes to the things that are actually beneficial for you in the long run will make a lot of this a lot easier, and the things that you can focus and identify on that are actually good for your community and not just something you should be doing or something that you feel guilty that you're not doing and then you drag it out for a really long period of time, which is something I tend to do. It's very easy to just say up front, I'm sorry, I'm too busy, thank you for the opportunity. Please, if something like this comes up again, let me know. Or tell me sooner. I get invited to events, they're like, hey, it's happening in 2 weeks. I'm like, well, it's a little too short notice. So just care for your time and care for yourself as well. So just kind of as a quick summary, so think about the community that you want to have and the people that you want to work with, and base all of your actions on reaching these specific people. Be clear and concise and timely with your requests and communications. So you want to provide deadlines. You want to provide the tools and information to set people and your community up for success. Create mutually beneficial partnerships and arrangements to encourage meaningful participation, and be aware of your boundaries versus the needs of the community. So thank you. Here's my contact info, and thanks for coming to my very exciting talk.